Welcome back. It's National Sparky Day today, thanks to Klein Tools, supporting the trade since 1857. Give us a call this morning and you'll win a pair of insulated linesman pliers or a pair of fishing pliers. And someone who always adds a spark to our day and has joined us on the Barrett and Dodo open line on 13 12 55 is Daryl from Kingsley. Daryl, welcome.
Good morning, Duff. I liked your thoughts in relation to what you would do if you could speak to the AFL. In terms of myself, I'd like to see the AFL get even tougher on head contact in the way that they should police more the leading of the head into a tackle or a contest, which I think now with the advent of head contact issues, that needs to be outlawed out. And also the AFL not be afraid to suspend players for actions that can lead to particular issues during the season. So as much as push into the pack, Jimby should have been suspended, and therefore it sets precedent for the rest of the season.
So let's take the most recent example, and obviously it's very pertinent at the moment with Jeremy McGovern having to front a medical board over his concussion issues. What would you have done with Jake Melcham and that shunt into the players in front?
I think it should be a suspendable action, especially with the outcome of any sort of concussion-related HIA. So I think a bit like the bump and a bit like other tackling techniques such as the slamming tackle, yes, you may try to get yourself an advantage in a marking contest, but you always run the risk of suspension if you get it wrong.
And you mentioned players pointing their head at the tackler, which they do. I mean, let's say Nick the Wizard Watson, he's a classic at it at the moment. He practically dives into the tackle. What would you do with them if that's a punishable offence? What would the punishment be?
Initially, it would be a fine for staging, in my opinion, but then obviously accumulation of points should lead to a suspension after that. So therefore, we start getting rid of these particular actions because in the light of the HIA and the concussion issues, I don't think it's a good action at all. And plus, a mandatory possible time off to get an assessment rather than on-field assessment as well. So therefore, what happens is you've got to be careful if you're going to play for those particular kicks.
Yep, I think it's a valid point, Daryl, and also probably an interesting suggestion. It'll be interesting to see if other people take a view on that and are able to chew it over on the show today. Thanks for your call.
Thank you very much, Duff.
0487 736 736. That is the Harvey Norman Busselton text line if you want to have your say on what Daryl has spoken about. Of course, you can also call us on the Barrett and Dodo open line on 13 12 55 as Daryl did. Jonathan Horn is a great columnist with The Guardian. He's their sports columnist. He joins us on the show. We're going to chat over a few of the issues confronting the AFL at the moment. Jonathan, welcome.
Hello, Duff, and credit for getting a Leslie Nielsen quote in there, mate. Very impressive.
Yeah, well, we were actually very confused because apparently in Australia that movie was known as Flying High and everywhere else it was known as Aeroplane, which was something that caught us off guard when we're trying to actually track it down just to relive it. So there you go. You learn something new every day.
Sure.
What sort of things do you reckon the AFL would have been discussing with those four coaches at that meeting at the Fitzroy pub?
I think that with the coaches, and obviously they've split it up into sort of groups of 3 and 4, and before they get to the non-Victorian teams as well, I think foremost with the coaches last night, not sure what Fitzroy pub they were at, there's some good ones there, as you say, but definitely the soft cap is something that's at the forefront of what they're thinking about at the moment. They're very, worried about retaining assistant coaches on the current salaries that they have to pay them, but also high performance staff and things like that. So I imagine that would be sort of centre of the conversation, and also umpiring. I think umpiring and rules and the sort of associated things with umpiring aren't great at the moment. Haven't been great for quite a while. And I think, that's something that the coaches feel that they can't really come out and say that in a press conference. but a pub in Fitzroy is probably a good place to sort of loosen the shoulders a bit and talk about those things.
You can definitely get the shoulders very loose at a pub in Fitzroy, Jonathan. I can vouch for that. Jeremy McGovern is facing a medical panel to see whether he should or should not play on. What usually happens when it gets this far with a player and a concussion issue?
Yeah, it's pretty rare when they go to those concussion panels. The decision usually goes one way. I think a couple of relevant ones recently, also in cricket with Will Pucovski here in Victoria, but the other one was Nathan Murphy, and there was almost that sense of relief in a way that it's taken out of the players' hands. That it's a sort of independent judgment on these things, because the players often want to play. I mean, that makes sense, but their families and the people who care for them, are concerned about them, and it's good to get an independent view of it. I think what you said before about that passage of playing in 2018 and how vivid that is in the memories of Eagles fans, and that sort of, we want Jeremy to be able to remember that as well. That is absolutely paramount. And if you listen to John Platten, for example, talk about the 1989 grand final, he can't remember a single thing, not just of that game, but of the entire day and the lead up into the day. The last thing he remembers from that game is the grand final parade on the Friday afternoon. And that's just tragic. That's absolutely tragic in so many ways. So, look, I think that that often when it's young players, they feel like they still have something to prove, and they desperately want to keep playing. McGovern has nothing to prove. He has nothing more to prove. He's sort of seen it all in footy, the good and the bad. He's been a fantastic player. Obviously, we'll wait to see how this plays out. But, in terms of, we shouldn't be sort of squeamish about telling these players to stop playing, I think.
There are rumblings at Essendon in the wake of that very poor performance against the Western Bulldogs on Saturday night. The old chestnut got dragged out, that Paul Little might come back to the club. And, of course, Caroline Wilson raised the suggestion that James Hird might be part of that as a potential coach. This sounds to me like a dog trying to crawl back to its vomit, and I was pleased to see James Hird knock it on the head on his show with Eddie Maguire last night. But how bad are the rumblings at Essendon in the wake of that performance? It feels like the Bombers are frustrated by a lack of progress, and they want to go not back to the future but back to the past all the time whenever they get one of these outcomes.
They're definitely a club that defers to the past, I think, more than any other club in the AFL. I think they have some very prominent voices sort of, on the fringes of the media and, former board people and things like that. They're very much a club that pines for that glorious past, I think. And I think David Barham, to his credit, has been someone who's sort of been really kind of vehement in saying, the game isn't like that anymore. That's not how you build lists. That's not how you build successful sort of programs at a club. There's this kind of prevailing thought with a lot of former sort of Essendon people that you can just snap your fingers and we go back to the Sheedy days. But if you think like that, you just tread water for 10, 20 years. I think it's really interesting. We get one football program that says, well, this is on, and then you get one that comes on half an hour later that says, no, it's off. Now, it says a lot about the media landscape.
It doesn't say much for us, I have to say.
And there's this. And look, the second program in question had the actual current coach and the former coach who's been speculated sitting next to one another on a panel. So it's a very strange situation. Having said that, that's not to say that there aren't rumblings at Essendon. They're always there, and it's a very sort of loud minority, and it's quite amazing that this comes after one loss. I think every team in the AFL, even the best teams this year, have had at least one really poor game. Essendon have had two, obviously, but they've won. They've sort of been doing. Brad Scott, he hasn't got a lot to work with, Brad Scott, and he's actually been doing a pretty decent job, apart from Saturday night, with what he has. They've been having a crack. They've finally got their team defence going, and now he has to sit there and sort of explain and defend all this. It's a distraction Essendon don't need, and I actually think that they handled it pretty well last night.
Their list isn't good enough, is it? And this is where you're right, the ones that want a miracle at Essendon, really, it would be the football equivalent of a miracle, because you'd be trying to produce something with players who just either are incapable or at the very least not ready to do that. And that is how it works in the modern game. And I think John Worsfold, to his credit, tried to point this out to them on his way out of the door, that it's just not like it was when in the old days where clubs like Essendon and clubs like Carlton could just draw great players to their club because of the club that they were, pay more money than anyone else could, and get a better list, and therefore the results would follow. It's a completely different environment, but some people just don't seem to accept that.
Yeah, and it takes patience from everyone, and Essendon people have had to be patient more than any other supporter base, really, for the last 20 years. There's a lot that's gone wrong, and there's been a lot of false dawns, there's been a lot of promises, there's been a lot of sort of, oh, is this it? We're nearly there? No, we're not. We're sort of backtrack again. So, look, it's frustrating, I get it, but I think for the first time in quite a long time that they're on the right track. But that you can't have people leaking to footy classified after one bad loss. And like I said, credit to David Barham, because he's very much been someone who's nipped this in the bud all the way along.
Yep, they have to do what Richmond did in 2016 when there were dogs barking about Damien Hardwick and dogs barking about the board, and the board stood its ground and they reaped the rewards off the back of that. And it was they grabbed order from chaos, and it's very important that Essendon stay the course on this now, even though it might be a long course. Hey, Dogs v Cats, tomorrow at GMHBA Stadium. What are you expecting? What sort of reception do you think Bailey Smith will get from his former Bulldog teammates?
Yeah, expecting a great game. Two really good teams. Also two coaches who you can never quite tell how the game's going to play. I'd imagine both of them will pull surprises tomorrow night. They're definitely not predictable teams, either of those, especially Geelong. They're teams that sort of will change their mode during a game, halfway through a quarter, or almost completely flip the way they're playing. So it'll be interesting in that sense. Bevo says, we're not really going to spend too much time on this Bailey Smith thing. I'm not sure that's Bevo's way, to be honest. I think that he will be mentioning it. I think that Bevo loves a theme. He loves a sort of us against the world sort of mentality. And there's that sense with Bailey is that the Bulldogs kind of protected him and nurtured him for a long time. When he got himself in a bit of strife, Bevo went into bat for him very much. And I guess there's that underlying resentment a bit that Bailey has sort of gone and, says he's outgrown the Dogs and he's putting up his Instagram posts and all that. So I think that there'll be a little bit of niggle there. The Dogs are a team that bring a bit of niggle as well. So it'll be interesting, but it's good. It's great for the sport. They're two really informed teams. I think it'll be one of the games of the round and hopefully one of the games of the season so far.
Yep, I think it's going to be a fascinating clash. Two very good teams. I reckon the Dogs are almost the second best team behind Collingwood at the moment in the form that they're in. So it's going to be on for young and old, and they might be fighting like cats and dogs, Jonathan. A mental health round. We have a mental health game. Obviously, we have Spud's game. Obviously, the tragic events of the last week have brought this clearly into focus, and there is a strong push for the AFL to do more work in this space. What are your thoughts? Should we should we make more of Spud's game and perhaps make that a thing like the big freezies or, something like that, just one big game to really draw the focus? Or do you think we should have something like the Anzac round or Sir Doug Nicholls round where we spread this across a round?
Yeah, look, it's really hard to talk about, obviously, and I think it's too early for anyone to be making decisions on this, to be honest. Ideally, if they were to do this, I think it should be driven by the Selwood family, to be honest, and what they want and how they. But obviously, it's way too early to even vaguely think about anything like that. Look, I'm generally resistant to the idea that the AFL can help solve every societal problem that we have. I think they have a role to play. I don't think that having an entire round devoted to mental health is necessarily something that changes the ball game or pushes the needle, so to speak. So look, it's really hard. I think that often these things can shine a light on these sort of issues, and they can work. I also think that there's often overkill in terms of these rounds, in terms of other issues, and there is a fatigue among people when it comes to a certain cynicism that comes in with these rounds. So, like I said, I think that maybe further down the track it's something they might explore. I also think that the way they do it with the Danny Frawley game is really good. I think it strikes the right tone. I think it gets the balance right between overkill and getting that message out. I'm just not sure that we then need to do that for 8 other games in a round. So look, it's a really tough one, Duff, because it's been incredibly sad week for everyone, not just who loves footy, but for anyone who's a human being, really, in terms of what's happened this week. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, no, it's been as you say, a tragic week, I think, and I think we all just were almost without words when we first heard the news last weekend. And I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Let's let the dust settle on this, and then let's carefully plot a way forward. And maybe I tend to think that maybe one game like Spud's game is a good way to really concentrate the focus and make the public more aware, as opposed to diluting the message across a full round of footy. Jonathan, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, mate. You make a lot of sense. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to speaking to you again in the very near future.
No problem. Thanks, Duff.
Jonathan Horn, of course, he's a columnist with The Guardian in their sports section. Give us your thoughts. 0487 736 736. That is the Harvey Norman Bustleton text line. We'll be back with more after the break.